Dubrow Suspicion Files.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we've got a really fascinating stack of source material to get into. We are stepping into, well, a deep, dark, secret festering right underneath the most brilliant court in European history, the court of Louis XIV.
That's right. When you picture the Sun King, you see Versailles, right? This dazzling, perfectly controlled, magnificent structure.
Yeah, it's a physical manifestation of absolute order, of centralized power.
But that image, that whole idea, is a very carefully curated facade. And today, we are diving deep beneath that glittering surface to confront the political and moral reality of the Affaire des Poisons.
The Affair of the Poisons. This ran from roughly 1677 to 1682.
And this wasn't some, minor police matter, not just a handful of criminals. Our sources, and we have police records, judicial interrogations, even personal letters from the chief investigator, they reveal this sprawling systemic network.
A network of what?
Of poisoners, abortionists, and alleged sorcerers that threaten to infect the very heart of the French monarchy.
So we're talking about an entire shadow economy, one that's built on, death, desire.
Yeah.
And this just desperate craving for social and financial control in the Ancien regime.
Absolutely. And this conspiracy, it reached so high up into the French nobility that it forced the king himself to make an impossible choice.
What was the choice?
Pursue justice against his own family and risk the monarchy's entire moral integrity collapsing, or execute the commoners and just bury the truth.
Wow. The scale of this is immense. And to really get our heads around it, I think we have to understand the environment that let it all happen.
Exactly, the camouflage.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the world of 17th century Paris.
To really appreciate how a conspiracy dealing in mass murder and black magic could operate for so long and on such a grand scale, you have to look at the state of Paris itself.
Right, because Louis XIV might have moved the political center out to the manicured lawns of Versailles.
But the real rot, the source of all this, was festering in the back alleys of the capital city.
And Paris at this time, in the late 1660s, was a huge city, a real metropolis. We're talking 500,000 people.
500,000 souls, but with almost none of the infrastructure to handle that population. The sources describe it as this: overwhelming sensory assault. It was defined by its physical filth.
I mean, you could almost smell it through the pages.
You really can. Think about that population packed into these narrow, unpaved streets. This is long before any kind of standardized sanitation.
So you have chamber pots being emptied right out of upper-story windows.
Right, with that legendary and probably often ignored warning, "God low, watch out for the water!" And that waste, it just mixed instantly with mud, with blood and offal from butchers, with animal excrement.
The streets were described as a sulfurous stew.
It's the perfect description. The stench, the noise, the sheer visual squalor, it was inescapable. And that physical squalor provided the perfect camouflage for murder.
Okay, that's the critical link right there.
Because in the 17th century, death was just a daily banality. The sheer number of mortal diseases, dysentery, typhus, cholera, even just simple food poisoning, it meant that people expected to be violently ill. They expected death to come quickly.
So the symptoms caused by a clever poison, like arsenic.
Exactly. Violent vomiting, bloody diarrhea, dehydration. They were completely indistinguishable from all these rampant natural diseases.
So if a member of the court or a wealthy merchant just died suddenly, the doctor would chalk it up to the latest plague or a bad stomach.
He'd have no reason not to. The ubiquity of death was the poisoner's single greatest asset. It blurred that line between illness and, malicious intent.
And while the aristocracy is living in these grand mansions, the hotels, particuliers in the Marais.
The social structure was still incredibly porous. The elite relied completely on their service classes, their attendants, their cooks, their valets.
And these domestic workers were the bridge.
They were the conduit. The necessary connection that linked the glittering palace to the deepest, darkest parts of the Parisian underworld.
But what was driving this whole criminal enterprise? It wasn't just poverty, was it?
No, not at its core. It was political and social desperation that originated at the very top.
The court itself.
That's the key psychological piece.
Still.
At the court of Louis XIV, proximity to the monarch was everything. It was the sole determinant of a noble's survival.
So if the king stops favoring you, or your husband loses a political battle,
it meant social death, financial ruin, exile.
So when you're facing that kind of existential panic and the church and the law offer you nothing, where do you turn?
You turned to the shadow economy. It didn't matter if you were a high-ranking duchess or a frustrated shopkeeper. You were driven to the same obscure doors.
Looking for the divineresses, the alchemists.
The people operating in districts like Villeneuve-sur-Gravois, the ones who promised solutions that the church and the law could not provide. And they often used a very effective blend of ritual magic and lethal chemistry.
So the desperation created the demand, and this porous social system created the supply chain.
And this whole sprawling network might have gone on forever, if not for one man, and his revolution in administrative order.
Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie.
Exactly. Before the late 1660s, policing in Paris was a mess. It was fragmented, totally ineffective. But in 1667, the king's finance minister, Colbert, he appoints La Reynie as the first lieutenant general of police.
And this was a genuine revolution in how a city was run. This new office had immense, unprecedented power.
His mandate was comprehensive.
Yeah.
It was almost modern. He was responsible for sanitation, for flood control, street lighting. He's the one who famously introduced thousands of lanterns to make the streets safe at night.
But also for public morals.
And public morals. La Reynie was a methodical, rational man. He wanted to impose Enlightenment order on all that chaos.
And he did this by building what was essentially a proto-modern surveillance state.
He built this incredibly efficient network of mouches, literally flies, his spies and informants.
And these spies were everywhere.
Everywhere. Embedded in coffee houses, in markets, in the domestic service of noble houses. And it was this network, La Reynie's eyes and ears, that first picked up these faint, chilling whispers of a specific product circulating in the underworld.
Inheritance powder.
Inheritance powder. And we owe everything we know today to La Reynie's meticulous methods. His records are our primary source.
It's incredible that they survived.
It is. And it was through these detailed investigations that La Reynie made this chilling realization, something he confided in private letters. He saw how high the conspiracy reached, and he concluded. His words were, the enormity of their crimes proved their safeguard.
Let's just pause on that phrase. That is the ultimate statement on the political reality of the Ancien regime.
It is. The conspiracy was so vast, it implicated so many powerful people that the state literally could not afford to prosecute them all.
Because the scandal would have brought down the entire moral structure of the monarchy itself.
Precisely. And that sets the stage for everything that follows.
Okay, so before La Reynie's network exposed the whole organized syndicate, the legal and psychological groundwork was laid by one person, right? A single notorious figure.
The foundational case for the entire affair. The trial and execution of the Marquise de Brinvilliers in 1676.
She was the catalyst.
Yeah.
The aristocratic amateur who made poisoning almost fashionable in high society.
Brinvilliers, her full name was Marie-Madeleine Marguerite d'Aubray. She was a case of passion mixed with just naked greed. Her story starts with an illicit affair with a cavalry officer, a man named Gaudin de Sainte-Croix.
And her father, a high-ranking official, tried to put a stop to it.
He did. He was the civil lieutenant of Paris, and in classic Ancien Regime fashion, he used the most arbitrary power available to the king.
The lettre de cachet.
The lettre de cachet. For anyone listening, this was basically a sealed letter from the king ordering imprisonment or exile without any trial, without any reason given.
So he has his daughter's lover thrown in the Bastille.
Correct. But the irony is just tragic. He tried to separate them and end the affair, but instead, he unwittingly ensured their radicalization and ultimately their infamy.
How so? What happened in the Bastille?
Well, during his incarceration, Sainte-Croix becomes steeped in the art of poisoning. He meets other prisoners, possibly even the famed Italian poisoner 𝐏𝐃𝐂𝐃, and later he's associated with a legitimate Swiss chemist,
Christopher
Glaser, who paradoxically was the king's own apothecary. But his chemical recipes were quickly recognized as having a much more sinister dual-use purpose.
And this brings us to the chemical weapon of choice, the silent killer that really defined this entire era.
Arsenic trioxide, chemically as euro.
But back then it was known as poudre de succession.
Inheritance powder. And it was the chemical backbone of the entire affaire de poison.
Let's break down the chemistry of stealth here, because this is why it works so well against that backdrop of 17th century life we talked about.
It's a white, extremely fine powder. And its most critical feature is that it's fundamentally odorless and, crucially, virtually tasteless.
So it dissolves easily.
Well, not so much in plain water, but it dissolves readily in anything with a strong flavor, like the heavily spiced wine they drank at the time or a thick broth. And it was so easy to get. It was sold legitimately as a powerful rat poison.
And as we discussed, its physiological effects were a perfect mimic of natural death.
Exactly. Ingestion causes acute gastroenteritis, violent repeated vomiting, agonizing abdominal cramps, bloody diarrhea, extreme dehydration. Any 17th century doctor seeing those symptoms would automatically think cholera or dysentery.
The medical ambiguity was the perfect cover.
Absolute cover. And Bryn Vitheris, who wanted financial independence, which was impossible while her father and brothers controlled her fortune, she turned this weapon against her own family.
Starting with her father in 1666 and then her two brothers in 1670.
And her methods were careful. She used multiple small doses over a long period, slow poisoning, to gradually weaken them until their eventual and seemingly natural collapse.
There are anecdotes in the sources that paint her as almost scientifically detached in her ambition.
Yeah, the most disturbing allegation is that she didn't just target her family. Contemporary accounts claim she used her charitable visits to sick patients in Parisian hospitals as a kind of testing ground.
What?
She would allegedly test her concoctions on these unsuspecting ill people, observing the exact effects, the dosages, the time frames, with what was described as a grim scientific detachment.
So she was refining her craft before using it on her own blood. That's incredibly cold.
It is.
So if she was this methodical, how did the whole plot finally unravel?
Pure chance. Just anticlimactic luck. Sans-Croix, her lover and mentor in all this, he died in 1672. Not from poison, but from natural causes.
The irony.
Exactly. And critically, he left behind a red leather box, la cassette. He was deep in debt, and he had ordered his servants to burn this box unopened if he died.
But of course they didn't.
Of course not. His creditors, looking for anything of value, insisted the box be opened. And inside,
The evidence.
vials of poison, clearly labeled, and highly incriminating love letters from Brinvilliers that detailed all of her crimes. It was irrefutable.
So she fled.
She did, for 4 years across Europe. But Lorraine's new centralized police network was relentless. They tracked her down in Liège in 1676.
And her fate became this huge public spectacle. It was a warning about this new type of crime.
After a sensational trial, she was subjected to judicial torture, the water cure. She confessed everything, and was publicly beheaded at the Place de Grève on July 16, 1676. Her body was then burned.
But her final words on the scaffold were prophetic, weren't they? And incredibly dangerous for the crown.
She cried out of so many guilty people, must I be the only one to be put to death? Half the people in town are involved in this sort of thing.
She was signaling that this went way beyond her.
She was telling them that her case wasn't an anomaly, it was just the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, so Brinvilliers was the amateur. She was the aristocratic fire that drew all the attention to the problem. But if Lorraine really wanted to understand the threat, he had to uncover the professional operation.
The business. The one providing poison not out of passion, but purely for profit.
And here's where it gets really interesting. We move from this isolated tragedy to a syndicated, scalable criminal machine run by one woman.
Catherine Monvoisin, known to everyone as Love Voisin.
And she was a true entrepreneur of the underworld.
She absolutely was. She didn't just sell poison. She monetized the desperation and superstition of the age through this incredibly shrewd, tiered business model. It was designed to capture clients from the lowest commoner all the way up to the highest duchess. She understood her market better than anyone.
Her public image was just a simple fortune teller, right? That was the camouflage.
That was tier one of her business, aesthetics and divination. She was a master of parlor tricks, reading palms, chiromancy, using physiognomy to predict character. And she sold all these dubious beauty products, creams, lotions, even mixtures she claimed could, enhance the bust.
So that kept her doors busy, made her operation look visible but harmless.
Exactly. But then the services became much, much darker.
Catering to the realities of 17th century life.
Tier 2 was essential medical services, and by that I mean she was a prolific abortionist.
Right. In an era with no birth control, an illegitimate child meant total social ruin, especially for women of status.
So Lavoisin provided emptyings for women who had gotten themselves into trouble. This was a high-volume necessary service, and the disposal of the fetuses, which we'll get into, was systematic. It often involved a large furnace in her garden or just secret burials.
And then there was the most dangerous, most exclusive service, Tier 3.
This was for the special client, the specialized intervention. This was ritual magic and the poudre de succession, the chemical poisons.
So if a client needed a more definitive solution,
To acquire an inheritance, to remove an abusive husband, to sabotage a rival at court, Lavoisin guaranteed results. And she did it by marrying the power of ritual with the absolute certainty of chemistry.
Okay, we have to address the most horrific and sensational statistic that comes out of the police records here.
The 2,500 babies.
The claim that Lavoisin burned or buried upwards of 2,500 infant bodies in her garden over her career.
This figure, it demands rigorous scrutiny. It's an astronomical number, and it originated from confessions that were extracted under extreme duress and torture.
And later historians like Michelet and Voltaire, they seized on this figure.
They did, precisely because of its shock value. They used it as this potent symbol to critique the moral rot and the perceived decadence of the Ancien regime. It serves a political function in the historical narrative.
Let's talk about the forensic feasibility of that claim, though.
Logistically, disposing of 2,500 bodies in a suburban Paris garden over just a few years, without generating profound, unmissable suspicion from neighbors, it's highly improbable.
So the scale is almost certainly an exaggeration.
But it's certainly hyperbolic. But that hyperbole obscures a very gruesome reality that the police raids did confirm.
Right, the grain of truth is still there.
Absolutely. The undeniable truth is that Lavoisin was a very high-volume abortionist. When Lorrainese police raided her property, they did uncover human remains, bone fragments, and a furnace that showed clear signs of biological incineration. So while the number 2,500 is likely manufactured to satisfy the judge's desire for shocking satanic detail,
The crime itself, the high-volume abortion disposal, that was real.
that was very real. And the inventory they seized during the raids perfectly shows the hybrid nature of her business. It's this macabre blend of the purely occult and the toxicological.
What kind of occult props did they find?
Things designed to instill dread and confidence in her clients. We're talking about blobs of hanged man's fat, nail clippings, bone splinters, specimens of human blood, excrement, urine, and semen. These were the elements for the rituals, the visual aids for the magic.
But the real instruments of death were the chemicals they found right alongside them.
Correct. The police seized large quantities of arsenic, which we've talked about, but also corrosive nublimate, that's mercury chloride, and nitric acid.
Okay, that's a critical technical point. Corrosive sublimate, it's also a white powder, but it acts very differently from arsenic, doesn't it?
Very differently. Unlike the stealthy arsenic, corrosive sublimate is extremely painful when you ingest it. It causes immediate, violent, painful burning of the mouth and throat. It leaves obvious lesions.
So why would she stock both? If arsenic was the perfect, tasteless stealth killer, why risk using something so conspicuous?
That's a fascinating question about her methods. Arsenic was for the slow, stealthy inheritance murder, the one that had to look natural. Corrosive sublimate was fast, painful, and definitive.
So maybe for a situation where the victim had to die right now.
And stealth was less important than speed. Or maybe just to satisfy a client's demand for a different kind of magic or potion. The fact she stocked both shows a real professional adaptability to her client's needs.
Ultimately, the clients paid for the magic.
The invocation of demons, the whole ritual. But it was the chemistry that guaranteed the result.
So as Lorraine starts to connect all these dots, synthesizing this mountain of evidence, the case inevitably moves. It moves from the squalor of Paris into the glittering, gilded halls of Versailles.
And that's when the investigation transforms from a police matter into an existential state crisis.
When it implicates Françoise Athanaïs de Rochefort, Marquise de Montespan.
Montespan was no minor figure. She was the maîtresse en titre, the official royal mistress. She had produced 7 children with Louis XIV, all of whom he legitimized and brought into the nobility. She was at the absolute apex of political and social power.
And that position, being at the apex, was precisely what led to her desperation.
By the mid-1670s, the king's affection was clearly waning. Montespan was being actively challenged by 2 rivals, the intensely pious Madame de Maintenon,
Who represented the king's gradual turn towards religious piety.
and the younger, more vibrant Mademoiselle de Fontanges.
And in that political system, a woman's entire existence hinged on the king's sexual and emotional favor. Losing that meant total, absolute ruin.
Her motive wasn't malice toward the king, not at first. It was an overwhelming, existential panic over losing her status and power. So she sought out Lavoisin.
Not for regicide, but for a love charm. Something strong enough to restore her monopoly on his affection.
Exactly. And this desperation led to the most explosive and gothic allegations of the entire affair, the Black Mass.
The testimony for this, it came from Lavoisin's own daughter, right?
primarily from her daughter, Marguerite Monvoisin, and the renegade priest who performed the rituals, Etienne Guibourg. They detailed these services that were specifically intended to invoke powerful demons, Astaroth and Asmodeus.
To compel Louis XIV to return his affection solely to Montespan.
That was the goal.
Can you describe the ritual mechanics? As they were laid out in the official testimony, this is a scene of just profound transgression.
The testimony describes a setting of pure Gothic horror. Montespan's body allegedly served as the literal altar. She would lie naked across a mattress supported by chairs holding the chalice on her stomach.
And Guibourg, the priest, would perform this grotesque mockery of the Catholic Mass over her body.
A complete inversion of the sacred rite.
And the alleged sacrifice that sealed the pact.
Guibourg testified that the central, horrifying act involved infant sacrifice. He claimed he would slit the throat of an infant during the ritual, letting the blood flow into the chalice.
And this blood was then mixed with the consecrated host and the wine.
A truly blasphemous sacrament, and this mixture was allegedly dried, powdered, and then intended to be administered to the king in his food as a powerful love potion, guaranteed to restore his passion.
The idea of the king's own mistress participating in child sacrifice, that's enough to collapse any government. How did she maintain the link to the underworld without exposing herself completely?
That responsibility fell to Claude de Verne, known as Mademoiselle Désirée. She was Montespan's closest lady-in-waiting, and she served as her crucial proxy.
She was the intermediary.
Testimony suggested Désirée made over 50 visits to the poisoners, carrying messages and, most importantly, the payments.
Was she implicated in the rituals as well?
She was. Some allegations suggested that when Montespan couldn't attend, or maybe was just too disgusted, Désirée sometimes served as the naked altar in her place.
So her deep involvement made her an extreme liability.
A huge liability. The king spared her public execution, but she was forced to retire from court in 1678 and died in disgrace in internal exile in 1687. She was a politically managed disappearance.
The plan was originally about securing love, but when that failed, the plot, according to the sources, it escalated. It escalated into the unthinkable.
As Louis's disinterest persisted and his favor clearly shifted to Fontarge, the conspirators allegedly switched objectives. The investigation uncovered a plan to poison the king himself.
Along with a new mistress.
Along with Mademoiselle de Fontanges. The poison was allegedly going to be delivered through a piece of paper handed to the king as a petition, or maybe via poisoned gloves. This was the moment of ultimate danger.
This direct threat of regicide, the planned murder of the absolute monarch, that must have forced Lorraine's hand.
It did. He realized this police matter was now an existential crisis for the state. He had no choice but to inform Louis XIV directly, and that set up the most difficult political decision of his entire reign.
Before we get to the king's response, we have to confront the primary liability of our historical record.
The process.
The process by which all these sensational details, the 2,500 babies, the mechanics of the Black Mass, were actually secured. And that requires a deep look at judicial torture, or la question.
In the ancient regime legal system, where forensics were completely absent, the confession was revered as the queen of proofs.
Circumstantial evidence, no matter how strong, it just wasn't enough for a death sentence.
This is crucial. The law required a confession. And torture wasn't just arbitrary sadism. It was a strictly regulated, systematic mechanism of truth extraction.
And it was applied in 2 stages.
The question ordinaire, to get the initial conviction, and the question extraordinaire, which was applied right before execution. And its only purpose was to force the condemned to name all of their accomplices.
Let's talk about the methods. The one they used on Brinvilliers and Lavoisin, the water cure, la question par l'eau.
The method was designed to simulate drowning and suffocation. The accused was bound tightly to a trestle, unable to move. A horn or a funnel was forced into their mouth, and water was systematically poured into the stomach.
And the dosage was legally mandated.
It was. 4 cocamars of water, that's roughly 8 pints, for the ordinary stage.
And if that didn't work?
They moved to the extraordinary dosage, doubling the amount to 16 pints. The agony came from intense gastric distension, crushing the diaphragm and internal organs, and the sensation of being drowned from the inside out.
I remember you said when they started applying it to Brinvilliers.
She reportedly remarked, "They must be planning to drown me. As tiny as I am, I could never swallow such quantities."
And for male prisoners, especially the difficult ones, there was the boot, le brodequin.
The boot was physically destructive. The prisoner's legs were placed and bound between 4 wooden planks. Then the executioners would hammer large wedges systematically between the two inner planks,
forcing them apart.
Yeah.
crushing the prisoner's tibia and fibula against the outer planks.
The physical cost of that method, according to the sources, was just catastrophic.
It was intended to be. The pressure often pulverized the bones. Some accounts even describe bone marrow being squeezed out from the fractures. The absolute, unendurable pain would lead to shock or a confession.
The philosophy was that only a guilty person could endure that much pain and still maintain their innocence, which is just flawed.
Deeply flawed. And this inherent brutality raises a massive red flag for us about the reliability of the most sensational testimony. The 2,500 babies, the hyper-detailed black mass rituals, that's the critical insight. The extreme pain generated confessions, but more importantly, it generated desired confessions. Prisoners like 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒, the priest, and Lesage, the magician, they were facing certain death. They quickly learned that the only currency they had left was information.
So by providing the judges with shocking, lurid testimony that implicated the highest-ranking courtiers,
Especially Montespan.
they were buying themselves time.
They were delaying their own execution. The judges would need more time to investigate, to cross-reference.
So the Black Mass narrative, in all its Gothic horror, could be seen as a kind of collaborative fiction.
Yes, a narrative constructed in the interrogation room. It combined the inquisitors' deep-seated fears of Satanism with the agony and desperation of the prisoners. The details were often fed back to the judge in the form the judge wanted to hear.
But this is where the physical evidence stabilizes the record for us.
Precisely. We can doubt the numbers, we can doubt the sensational ritual details, but the discovery of the furnaces, the human remains, and the large quantities of arsenic and corrosive sublimate that confirmed the absolute reality of the core crimes.
High-volume abortion, organized trafficking in poisons, and murder.
The torture exaggerated the scope, but it didn't invent the conspiracy.
Okay, so with the investigation pointing directly at his official mistress and the mother of his children, Louis XIV knew he couldn't rely on the normal, slow-moving Parliament of Paris.
No, to handle the volume and the extreme political sensitivity, he established a special court in 1679, the Chambre Ardente.
That fiery chamber.
It was designed to be swift, operating outside conventional law, giving the king the speed and ruthlessness he needed to contain the scandal.
And for the lower-ranking criminals, it was devastatingly effective.
It was. The tribunal's ledger records that between 1679 and 1682, they investigated 442 suspects and issued 367 arrest warrants. 36 people were executed.
Including Lavoisin.
Lavoisin was burned alive on February 22, 1680. The commoners bore the full, brutal weight of the king's justice.
But the whole machine ground to a halt the moment Lorraine delivered the final, damning dossier implicating Montespan. This was the true crisis of state.
Louis XIV was the most Christian king. His entire claim to absolute authority rested on the divine right of monarchs and the moral legitimacy of his court.
And if it came out that the mother of 7 of his royal children was an accused participant in child sacrifice and Satanism,
the moral foundation of the entire monarchy would be irrevocably shattered.
and this wasn't just an internal French problem, was it? The political context matters here.
Immensely. Europe was watching. Louis was constantly under scrutiny, especially from Protestant powers who were eager to portray the Catholic French court as morally decadent and corrupt.
So an accusation of Satanism and regicide involving his own mistress would have been endless ammunition for his enemies.
It would have weakened his diplomatic and military standing across the continent. So the king realized the only way forward was to prioritize the reputation of the state over the pursuit of pure justice.
He chose suppression.
A clear choice. Louis XIV suspended the Chambre Ardente in 1682, choosing to manage the crisis through complete silence rather than risk public exposure. He implicitly confirmed Lorraine's earlier observation: the enormity of their crimes proved their safeguard.
Montespan was protected by the sheer impossibility of punishing her without destroying the crown's image.
Exactly.
So what happened to the people who held all the secrets? Guy Borg, Lesage, Marguerite Montvoisin, the ones who could testify publicly against Montespan.
They were systematically disappeared. Louis used his arbitrary power, the lettre de cachet, to condemn them not to execution but to lifelong silent imprisonment in remote maximum security fortresses.
Places like Besançon and Salsis.
Exactly. They were kept chained, forbidden from speaking to anyone about their past, and died decades later in absolute silence. A public execution would have given them a final, dangerous platform.
Disappearance ensured their silence and the state's security.
And the evidence wasn't just silenced, it was literally destroyed.
Right. Lorraine was ordered to separate the specific sheets of testimony about Montespan from the rest of the records.
These documents were sealed in a leather chest, and either right before or right upon the king's death, the entire chest was burned.
Thankfully for us, Lorraine's personal notes survived.
His meticulous correspondence survived, giving us the full, horrifying picture.
So the immediate crisis was managed through suppression, but the affair still forced a reckoning with the danger of these substances. It had a lasting legislative legacy.
The trauma of the Affaire de Poison was a direct catalyst for administrative reform. In July 1682, Louis XIV issued a landmark edict that's widely considered the birth of modern pharmacy regulation in the West.
What did the Edict of 1682 actually mandate?
It formally classified arsenic, mercury chloride, and similar substances as strictly controlled poisons. And crucially, it mandated that apothecaries must keep a meticulous, verifiable register of all sales.
They had to record the buyer's name, the stated purpose.
The buyer's name, their stated purpose for the purchase, and the amount sold. This was a massive step toward accountability and traceability. It transformed an unregulated over-the-counter poison into a dangerous, controlled substance.
It also redefined the state's relationship with the occult.
That's a subtle but massive philosophical shift. The edict explicitly criminalized divination and sorcery, but it reframed them. It dismissed them not as powerful supernatural acts that threaten God's dominion,
But as fraud.
as fraudulent and dangerous superstitions practiced by charlatans and criminals. The state moved away from hunting witches as adversaries of faith and began prosecuting them as simple criminals who endangered public safety.
Yet, despite all this reform, the core forensic problem remained completely unaddressed.
Absolutely. The edict could control the sale of the substance, but it couldn't detect its use. Convictions continued to rely on tortured confession and medically non-specific evidence.
Because 17th century doctors had no concept of modern toxicology.
Not at all. They were still largely operating under humoral pathology, the idea that sickness was due to an imbalance of the body's four humors.
So if a doctor saw vomiting and diarrhea, they treated the humoral imbalance, not the presence of a foreign chemical.
Exactly. All a doctor could do was perform a visual autopsy, looking for general signs of corrosion or blackened organs, signs that are medically ambiguous and often just happen during natural decomposition.
And the technology to actually detect arsenic wouldn't come for a long time.
The revolutionary chemical detection technology, the Marsh test, which can find minute traces of arsenic in human tissue, would not be invented for another 150 years, not until 1836. For the victims of the Affaire de Poison, that technology arrived far, far too late.
If we synthesize everything we've talked about, this story is so much more than just a historical crime wave. It's a profound commentary on the structure of 17th century French society. And looking at the lists of suspects and clients, the affair was overwhelmingly gendered.
That's the most compelling sociological takeaway. The vast majority of the practitioners, La Voisin, La Bosse, La Vigoureux, they were all women. And the majority of the high-profile clients, Montespan, the Comtesse de Soissons, they were also women. And this reveals a profound truth about power dynamics in the ancient regime.
We should define the constraints women faced in this era to really justify that claim that poison became the weapon of the weak.
Legally, women were almost entirely without agency. Marriage was rarely about love. It was an economic transaction orchestrated by fathers to secure titles and estates. And critically, once married, women legally ceded their property rights and their legal identity to their husbands.
And divorce was impossible in Catholic France.
Impossible. Legal separation was incredibly difficult, expensive, and carried intense social stigma.
So if a woman found herself married to an abusive, violent, or financially irresponsible husband, she had no legal way out, no way to protect her fortune or her life.
None whatsoever. In that constrained environment, poison emerged as the ultimate divorce in a bottle. A silent, quick, medically ambiguous method for women to regain control. By removing an unwanted husband or rival, they could instantly get back their fortune, their freedom, or their political standing. The poisoning ring was simply supplying a desperate market demand created by the rigidity of the French legal system.
And this applies to the court, too. For a powerful woman like Montespan, magic and poison were deployed as political tools.
Absolutely. For her, the Black Mass was not primarily an act of religious rebellion or devotion to Satan. It was a desperate political campaign waged through supernatural means.
because Louis XIV was an absolute monarch. His affections were an absolute variable that she couldn't control through normal political maneuvering.
Exactly. Her entire existence depended on his libido. So using the love potion was the only political maneuver she had left. It was the equivalent of a last-ditch campaign to secure her position.
So the affaire de Poison was ultimately a product of Louis XIV's system itself. The vast political stakes, the lack of legal recourse for women, and the administrative chaos that Lorraine was only just beginning to control.
It was the dark underbelly of the Sun King's glittering reign. It demonstrated that even absolute power could not sanitize or control the deep currents of human desperation that ran right beneath the perfect geometry of Versailles.
The affaire de Poison was ultimately the dark mirror of the Sun King's era. It revealed that beneath this projection of absolute order lay a festering cesspool of superstition, desperation, and calculated murder.
And the political fallout was immediate, and it was permanent. The scandal effectively ended that permissive age of mistresses that had defined the early part of Louis XIV's reign. It ushered in an era of rigid etiquette and somber piety, symbolized by the rise of Madame de Maintenon.
The ultimate lesson here, if we pull back, is that this scandal exposed the profound fragility of an absolute monarch. Louis XIV could command armies, he could dictate the terms of European peace, build the grandest palace in the world.
But he could not stop his own courtiers from buying arsenic in the backstreets of Paris to settle their scores and advance their social positions. His final solution was a display of power based on suppression, burning the evidence, and silencing the witnesses.
So what does this all mean for you?
It raises a powerful question about the true face of justice in that era, a question based on the documented fates of the key figures. The king was successful in erasing the most dangerous evidence, in silencing the prisoners who held the truth. The Marquise de Brinvilliers, the original amateur, was publicly executed and burned, her body reduced to ashes. But her powerful client, Madame de Montespan, the architect of the Black Masses, was merely eased out of court and died peacefully years later in a luxurious convent. What does the vastly different fate of the poisoner and the client tell us about the true, untouchable currency of power in the Ancien regime?